Pod. Pod. Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the 22 Grand Pod podcast. In this episode, we're talking to Tom Woodhead, who is lead singer of the band Forward Russia. Forward Russia were a band that were a big part of the lead scene back in the day, and really made the most of their short time together by releasing 2 albums in the space of 3 or 4 years. Tom was able to talk to me on a Friday night in lockdown from his own studio in Wakefield, and using his skills as a mastering engineer, he's able to talk to us using studio quality sound. How's lockdown in Wakefield going?
I don't know, we live in a really convenient location, to be honest, because we live like a 1 minute walk away from a Tesco, and like a 5 minute walk away from a really big Sainsbury's. So it's a piece of piss, really, to not leave the house very much.
Yeah, it sounds alright, to be fair. So you can join the queue from your house, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Can
you give us an idea of how you went from starting the band to releasing your first album?
Well, the band, me and Rob, the bass player in the band, were in another band called the Black Helicopters, and Whiskers was in a band who played guitar in the band and was sort of the brains behind all the music industry side of it. He was in a band called La Flamme, and we used to go see his band, and he liked our band. And when he wanted to do something new, he asked us if we wanted to. Well, he asked Rob originally if he wanted to do it, and then he couldn't think of another singer, so they ended up asking me. And then, Katie was obviously his sister, so I think he'd been wanting to do something musically with her for a while, because he knew she was a good drummer. And he ended up asking her, and from that point, I guess we just practiced a lot. Like we treated it quite seriously. Like we practiced 2 or 3 times a week, and because Whiskers was really into the music industry side and stuff, it was fun for the rest of us in that we didn't, we felt like that side of it was all handled by him, and we didn't have to get bogged down in it, which is half the pain in the arse of being in a band, is having to, do all the logistics. And which obviously became a problem later on when there was a load of logistics to do, and Whiskers was still doing a load of it, and he quite rightly resented us for not doing enough. But at the start, it was great. And then, I guess we never got signed, in inverted commas, like bands tended to. Well, were expected to back then, I guess, to release records. They weren't. There were loads of bands releasing records who didn't follow that model, but like to release records in the sort of popular domain. So we ended up releasing records on Whiskers' own label, because Whiskers wanted to start a label as well. And that was Dance to the Radio, who released records for quite a few bands who would probably be on this program, like the Pigeon Detectives and Grammatics, This Atal, I Like Trains, and loads of other lead stuff. And we released the first album ourselves, like just by gradually building up momentum and stuff. And obviously we had loads of help from management and agents and all that stuff. It's not like we were doing everything ourselves, but the label side of it was Whiskers' own label that then grew into a bigger thing.
Right, okay. There seems to be quite a big scene going on in Leeds. I mean, we've had Dan from Blackwire on who talked a bit about it, but seems to be a lot going on in Leeds at that point in terms of guitar bands.
Yeah, it was great, and it felt like to a certain extent a sort a proper scene. Not that there was no like defined musical homogeny about it, like all the bands sounded quite different, but there was just a good sort of camaraderie among that group of bands, at least. And I know it didn't encompass all of what Leeds was about at that time, and no scene ever encompasses anything about what any city is about at any given time, but to us it felt like a sort of tight-knit community.
Yeah. You must remember a lot of bands from back then. Do you have some favourite bands from around that time?
Well, definitely from, in terms of This Atal, who were like they were every band's favourite band,
Okay, right.
It's not what you really want when you're in a band, but they were incredible. Grammatics I really liked. They came along a bit later, but I thought they were really great. And I think their album is probably the best record to come out of that scene. And I Like Trains is another one that I really liked, and still like. And there are loads more.
It's hard to list them all. Obviously, like, you were unique in terms of the fact that all your songs were named after numbers in the first album. Can you give us a bit of an insight to that and what your thinking was behind that?
Yeah, it's like most things, really. Like, no one ever actually thinks these things through the way people assume they do. It was just that's what we called the songs in practice. Then we played a gig.
Okay, right.
Just because it was the order we wrote them in, and then we played a gig when that was on the set list, and it just sort of gradually stuck. I never particularly liked it, to be honest. I just thought it was a bit of a gimmick, and looking back, like, obviously it's fine. I can see it with outside eyes, and it is a gimmick, and having a gimmick is fine. But when you're a precious young, like, 20-year-old, you feel like your artistic pride's being wounded or something.
Yeah, I mean, so you formed in 2004. I mean, you worked quite quickly. Is it you had 2 albums out by 2008?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it was 2004 or sort of mid to late 2003, but I guess it probably would have gone on. If you got this off Wikipedia, it probably goes on when we played our first gig.
Right. Okay.
But I'm not sure. It might have been 2004. I'm not sure. But sorry, what were you saying?
No, I was just saying, like, what was the songwriting process like? Were we just firing out songs, or did someone bring songs to the table?
It changed quite a lot. Like, the early stuff was mostly an idea that Whiskers had to start with, and usually he had the guitar part and the bass part sort of worked out for sort of the start of a song, and we get into the practice room and develop it from there. There were a couple of really early times, we even sat around in his living room just messing about with it, with no drums or anything. But then, as we went on, in fact, to be fair, the whole first album, I think pretty much every song started with an idea from Whiskers, apart from maybe 13, which started with the synth part.
Okay.
They all had varying levels of kind of other people in the band chucking stuff in, but the initial ideas tended to come from Whiskers, and then the second album was a lot more. It was similar, but we sort of wrote in a different way, in that we dissected things probably even more than we did before, and took more attention over individual parts. And also, there were I think there were 12 songs on that album, and 4 of them started with my ideas, and 8 of them started with Whiskers' ideas. So that changed a little bit.
Yeah. And like, the reason why you started the band, was it, and the style of your music, was that influenced by bands around you or bands that you'd liked kind of growing up?
It's hard. I mean, I think it was a bit of a mishmash, to be honest, because I don't think we were influenced by any contemporaries at the start. It was stuff like the old, like, Whiskers was into all the sort of late 70s, early 80s post-punk stuff, which was popular at the time. Stuff like Gang of Four, and but then there was more like slightly older but still contemporary stuff like The Rapture, that sort of we were dimly aware of as things that sounded a bit like us, if that makes sense. But it weren't necessarily influences. We sort of, what we really liked about this band when we started it was, I think both Whiskers and Rob and I were in bands that felt quite constrained in what they could do, in terms of, there were a lot of songs that we could write that just wouldn't sound like those bands, if that makes sense. So you write a song, you're like, oh, it's a great song, but it doesn't sound like us, so it's not going to be credible if we play it. It's just going to sound weird. Whereas what we liked about Ford Russia at the start was that everything we did just sort of sounded like Ford Russia, and when we had ideas, we never had to discount them because it didn't fit into the kind of idiom of this band that we'd established. Like, I mean, you could term our old bands both vaguely as sort of garage rock bands to varying degrees, and there are sort of expectations when you're in a band like that, as to almost even down to kind of what notes you can use, like in a melody, or what notes you can use in a riff. And it was nice to not have any of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Then did you feel that it could like progress quite quickly with that kind of style, not having to worry about what it sounded like?
Yeah, well, that was. I mean, I don't know how quickly we did progress, but we. I'm not saying that as a sort of I don't think we progressed quickly. I'm saying I genuinely don't know how quickly we progressed. It's hard to keep it in my head, like when we wrote like 4 and when we wrote 9, if that makes sense. I'm not really sure what the gap between that was in terms of months or whatever, but I think there was definitely a sort of sea change when we wrote first 7 and then 9, and they were a lot poppier than the stuff we'd been doing, you know, in 1 to 6. And the good thing about naming your songs numbers is that you can very clearly go back and say what song was written at which point, which I think there's no way I'd be able to remember that otherwise. But
yeah,
7 and 9 were a lot more sort of focused and poppy. And I think from that point, that gave us a sort of a touchstone to build out from. And we could go poppier and we could go less poppy and more intricate, but it was a sort of more of a core sound than we had in the first 6 songs, which were a bit more. We experimented a bit more with doing different things in those first 6, I think.
Obviously, like your songs became. I mean, I remember, you know, most club nights I went to would play Forward Russia. So I mean, you must have gained a bit of a following and had some pretty good high points.
It's like the thing about being in a band is like when you start doing well is that you always looking at the next thing, the next like level up, the next step. So at the time, it's really hard to appreciate what the proper high points are, because you always think that it's going to get better, and that's, you know, it's a real shame, I guess. I don't know if that's just to do with age and, you know, you feel like you can accomplish anything when you're young or whatever. But I don't know. It's different every time I think about it. Like objectively, it feels like doing Reading and Leeds the year when we played the Radio 1 tent was a high point, because, you know, we packed out the tent both days, and, you know, there's probably like 10,000 people each day, and it was good, and that was great. But I don't know, the proper high points. A lot of the proper high points are just weird stuff that happens, you know, on tour, like just like singing stupid songs to each other on the bus, or you know, just weird stuff.
Like good memories kind of thing.
Yeah, and the gigs are great as well. But we played so many gigs like that, it's hard to separate them out sometimes. You know, the stories that stick in your mind are things like we had this old van that was always breaking down, like really an absolute piece of shit. But we owned it, so, you know, we tried to use it as much as we could. And I remember we had a gig in Birmingham one night, and the van broke down after the gig. It was like clear it was not going to work. And we had a gig in Brighton the next day. But Al, our tour manager, who was driving us around, he was under 25, so it was quite difficult for him to get a license for vans. Like there was only a few different places that would you know, give us that would hire them to us, because you have to be over 25 normally. So he ended up having to get a coach or a train from Birmingham up to Glasgow to pick up this van, and then the next day he drove in the morning from Glasgow, picked us up in Birmingham, and then we drove down to Brighton for the gig. So he's gone to Glasgow at the night, slept for about 5 hours, driven down, you know, all the way from Glasgow to Brighton, and this was on the hottest day of the entire year.
Yeah.
You know, and the van didn't have air conditioning or anything. It just had windows, you know. So every single person in this van is like in their underwear like by the time we get to Brighton. It just absolutely stinks. And we just get out and play this incredibly sweaty gig in the evening, just this really kind of oppressively hot gig. And that one sort of stands out as much for the stories around it as it does for the gig itself, but that helps you remember the gig as well, if that makes sense.
I remember, I've got memories of you guys playing on a Wednesday night Leeds Festival. Did that happen, or was it a rumour that didn't happen?
Yeah, was that? Yeah, the sort of I think it would have been Thursday night, wasn't it?
Was it 2007? Yeah, was it 2007?
The night before. Yeah, that was just after we just got back from recording our second album, and it was like the Dance to the Radio stage. So even though we weren't on Dance to the Radio by that point.
I remember a rumour going around the campsite, and it was like, oh yeah, Forward Rush are going to be playing tonight. But I can't remember if that actually happened in the end.
It wasn't like, I don't think it wasn't secret or anything. It was
Was
just,
it not?
it was
Oh,
on the lineup.
Oh, right. Yeah, it feels like it was news anyway.
Well, that's, yeah, pre-internet days, I guess. Like, things just seem exciting when they're just part of the routine anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that was the highlight of the year back then, definitely Leeds Festival. I was reading on NME about when you broke up and stuff, and you'd already started working in the studio and producing bands and stuff. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I'd always been really interested in that, and I always really enjoyed being in the studio with the band. And you know, I would bother the producers by asking them things and giving really inane suggestions and stuff. So it was something that while we were making the second album, which was done over a long period of time in really nice studios, like I said to myself that I was going to try and do this when we got back to the UK, because we recorded it in America. And yeah, I just started. I used to go on MySpace and just message bands that I liked the sound of and say, "Oh, do you want to record with me?" And occasionally a band would say yes. Then I started doing live sound at various venues and bits of touring sound and, you know, more recording. And then I eventually got into mastering, which is what I'm doing now. That's why we moved to Wakefield. I've built this mastering studio here. So, and
just looking briefly back at that, is there anything you'd have done differently about those early days?
I think just being a better overall human being, like not because
right, okay.
When you're kids, you can say mean things to people without realizing that you're being mean, or you can treat people in unnecessarily unpleasant ways. I'm not saying that that I was awful to anyone or anything like that, but you look back and you realize that there are ways you can make things easier for people, and also that there were ways you can make things easier for yourself. You know, I could have tried harder with various aspects of you know, the admin around the band and made things easier for Whiskers, but in terms of the vague trajectory, you can't really regret any of that stuff because it's just the past, isn't it? And everyone always says don't regret. I mean, I don't think you can regret it, purely because everyone looks back on things with nostalgia, don't they? If it was at least vaguely good, and
yeah, true. You
can't really go about regretting it then, because that robs you of the ability to be nostalgic about it.
Yeah, fair. Working closely with bands now, and you have been since then. How do you see it for new bands now?
I mean, I must admit, I don't. I mean, I obviously deal with bands every single day, but I'm not. Since I moved into mastering, I'm working. It's a much more detached kind of process. So I'm not hanging out with the band for 2 weeks recording an album or something.
Okay, right.
But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know where to start, to be honest, if I had a band now, and that's not saying that it's good or bad. I genuinely wouldn't know what to do first, because it seems like there are so many different options when it comes to just things like, it seemed like you never had to think about when we started it, you know, whether you were gonna, things like premiering tracks and stuff, which is something that really new bands do now, isn't it? Whereas even as, you know, recently as, you know, 15 years ago, you didn't premiere a track if you were a new band. You just played a load of gigs for a while, and then maybe you recorded something, and then even once you'd recorded something, it didn't seem like the process of promotion was quite so codified and structured as it is now.
Right. Yeah.
Where there were all these outlets, but there also seemed to be quite laid down tracks into how you promote yourself, and it makes sense because you're working within Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and these these systems that have a very defined way of being and a way of doing things. So you have to tailor everything you're doing to fit that, because that's how people discover music now, isn't it? And playlists and stuff like that. But so, in answer to your question, I don't really know, but I think it is very different.
I mean, it sounds like you guys were quite hands-on back in the day. Like, say, if you were on Whiskers record label, Did you get a real taste of what it was like to be on a record label, or was it kind of like you say, you were just doing it in the way you knew how, kind of thing?
Well, I think at the time, I was quite chippy about the fact that we were on our own label, and I tried not to say that, but
Yeah.
I definitely felt jealous of bands who were on what I considered to be proper record deals. But when you actually look back, I don't think there's much difference. I think most of the time, bands don't get what they're hoping to get out of record deals, and they end up doing just as much work because after the initial buzz dies down, you end up having to do all that stuff anyway because people stop paying for other people to do it for you. And what we actually ended up being able to do was, by severely underpaying all of our staff,
Right.
being able to have, a pretty similar infrastructure. And that is something I regret, actually, is that we didn't pay the people who work for us more. They were all young like us, and they were happy to do it for the meager money that we're offering. But I do feel a bit shitty that we paid them essentially poverty wages.
Yeah, just because you feel like you're taking advantage, kind of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. Because there's always, you're basically preying on the fact that someone really wants to do the job, aren't you? You're saying that, if we'll pay you 35 quid a day and you get to, come on tour and do sound, which is, it's fun when you're at a certain age, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't be paid, because we did think that the guy who was doing it was really good and the best person for our sound. So we should have been paying him more,
And just going back to what you were saying about, I was talking to Dan from Black White, and it sounds like they're in a similar situation to you. They had a record label that was purely to put their records out. And he was saying he knew a lot of bands that were getting signed, but that would get their albums shelved. And that kind of thing was going on. Did you have much experience with bands who, just didn't end up getting the music out, kind of thing?
Yeah, there were a few like that around in Leeds at the time. It's probably not fair for me to mention names because, if they wanted to talk about it, they can talk about it. But yeah, there were quite a few bands around Leeds at that time. And also bands that, bands like, do you remember the band Duels?
I'm not sure, no.
Well, Duels were another band from this era who, ended up releasing a couple of albums, but before that, they were a band called Sammy USA, and they had that kind of thing of recording for on development deals is what they.
Yeah, that's what Dan was saying.
They don't really exist anymore, but there were quite a few bands back then having these little development deals, and I think one or two of them did end up coming to something, but I don't know. It's a bit more of an idea of labels investing in bands, which is almost gone away, and bands are expected to do their own legwork for that first part. But at the same rate, a lot of those bands that ended up getting signed to development deals seem to be making incredibly safe music. So.
Yeah, so we're just got out of fashion quite quickly.
Well, I think the bands on development deals quite often tended to be bands that sounded like slightly poppier versions of things that had just recently been popular. So they get given money for 6 months to, write songs and do demos and stuff. And then they come back, and whether that thing might be popular or it might not, but
it's not the real deal, kind of thing.
I think. Well, and also I think if you give a band a load of money to make some music, and they're already because you've chosen them because they're doing a more accessible, poppier version of something that's big at the time, and they go away and think, oh well, this major label's giving me some money, so we'd better get even poppier. And I think that's what often happened, is that the bands either they didn't understand that the label wanted hits, or they tried too hard to get hits. It rarely seems to be that sort of middle ground where creative stuff happens.
Yeah, that's what something I was saying to. The latest one I've done is with Ross from the Futureheads, and he was saying after their second album they were getting mixed reviews, and they have this dilemma where it's do we try and pander to the audience or do what we want to do? And I guess when you start going down the route of pandering to your audience, it's always going to come short, I guess. Do you think? Yeah,
well, definitely. I mean, it's hard to, it must be even harder nowadays because you're so aware of what everyone thinks of everything you ever do, aren't you?
Yeah, very true. Yeah.
And that's the other thing that's hugely changed is, back when we were going, and I sound like such an old fart saying this, but it wasn't even that long ago. But you'd release a record and you'd maybe end up reading 20 reviews of it over the course of it being out, on various magazines and on websites and stuff. And that's a part. We had a fan forum that fans of the band posted on that I'd read, but apart from that, that was the only feedback we really got about the records. About our music was like people writing reviews, and they were mostly not incredibly negative. But I mean, I'm sure now, like if you become even slightly popular, you just get dickheads criticizing you all the time, like right to your face. So
yeah, that's another thing that's been coming up is like you say, like the instant reaction and people getting, basically people hammering them from day one, and it's stopping creativity kind of thing.
Well, especially now, like, and the more you do yourself, like the worse the neuroses gets. So you get some kid who's done like a really nice sort of thing all himself. He's recorded all the instruments. It sounds nice. He's done some electronic stuff with it or whatever.
Yeah.
And he puts it up, and then some dickhead who's never done anything is criticizing every element of it, from the songwriting to the mixing to the sound choices and they've got a platform to do that. And this guy who's never put anything online before in his life and has never been brave enough to put it out there is all of a sudden just got this absolute nobody telling him it's all wrong. And unfortunately, that's one of the things that happens on the internet, is that the people who speak the most quite often know the least.
Good point. And to be fair, Dan was saying they used to get people coming up to them back in the day saying that Black Wire weren't a proper band because they had a drum machine, which I found quite funny for the 21st century.
Yeah.
Well, the big thing of this podcast is looking back at that time and seeing if people, because obviously it seems like a really like golden era for guitar bands now. Did you feel like part of a community back then of bands?
Definitely in terms of the lead stuff. Not so much the broader national sort of. I mean, you build up small friendships with bands, but most of the main bonds we had were with other bands from Leeds.
Okay, right. And did you help each other out? Like I was speaking to, I suppose it's almost a different scene in London, but had a podcast with the Paddingtons and the others where they'd help each other out, putting each other on support slots. Was that the kind of same thing in Leeds where you'd help each other out kind of thing?
Yeah, well, Whiskers was like, he was like the Tony Wilson of Leeds at that point. So he was he was putting on loads of gigs anyway, and he'd put on loads of all-dayers and stuff like that. And we were releasing, Dance to Radio was releasing compilations of, with like 20 bands on and stuff like that. So it very, very much felt like a community based. Well, for us, it was a community based around Dance to Radio.
Okay, right. And obviously, if you look forward to 2013, when you get like reformed for some gigs, can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it was Nath who runs the Brood Nathan Clark.
Yeah.
They wanted to do something to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Brood and just kind of, I think, independently managed to get me and Whiskers quite drunk and agree to it, like at different times. Like, not that he was getting us drunk, but he managed to catch us both in the Brood after we've had a few drinks and independently say, well, if he's up for it, I'm up for it, kind of thing. And we both did. And then, which is, quite disrespectful to Katie and Rob, to be honest, who are equally important members of the band. But we then, I think, asked them if they'd also be up for it. And so we did it, and it was fun.
Okay. And did you remained mates in that time kind of thing?
Oh, yeah, there was no big falling out or anything like that. I see Rob, quite a lot. Look, Rob's been, one of my biggest mates since we were like 11, so...
Okay, right. And had you been writing music in that time?
Various bits. I tried to do bits of music on my own occasionally and never came up with anything I was particularly happy with. And I definitely consider myself retired from making music now. Whiskers has done a lot more than me. He's played guitar on various records and he released a solo album. And Katie's done bits and pieces, but I don't think any of the bands she's done anything with have released out. But I think we were quite burnt out, to be honest, by the end of Forward Rusher, because we went at it so hard for those 4 years, especially sort of 2005 and 2006. I think there was one year where we played more than 200 gigs. So it was like, basically, if you weren't playing a gig, you were usually traveling somewhere. And if you weren't traveling somewhere and you were at home, you were sort of collapsed.
Right, yeah.
And, but we still, I mean, to be fair, we still ended up going out to gigs on the nights we were home, which seems incredible now. I can't imagine doing that. But it was just like incredibly hard work, and it felt like every single waking moment was taken up by the band, which, I don't, as I say, I don't regret it, and I wouldn't change it, because it's a unique thing to experience, and it was a great part of my life. But I think it was just, everyone was just burnt out by the whole experience.
Yeah. So 5 years off, playing gigs again.
Yeah, it was lovely. Yeah, I mean, we weren't sure how. I mean, I was fairly confident that we'd at least sell out the Broodnell, because I just thought we had enough people that would want to come. Whiskers wasn't as confident, but then we ended up selling it out in like half a day. So that was, straight away, that was like, right, people are interested. Let's try and remember how to play these fucking songs. So yeah, and we didn't play the greatest gig of our lives. We weren't the tightest, but it was just nice to, and because as well, everyone in that room, they were the people who really loved the band. From all around the country, and some people from Europe. It just like sort of probably 70-80% of the people that loved Forward Russia the most in one room. It was really nice.
And then you played another gig the year after, is that right?
Yeah, and to be honest, we weren't gonna do it, but it was like Andy, who was booking the Live at Leeds for Future Sound, was like, "Oh, do you want to do it?" And we thought, oh. And it was like, once they said it was at the town hall, that was a bit of a draw, and then they offered us quite good money to do it. So
right.
So that was a nice second gig. It didn't feel like we'd ruined it.
Yeah. Okay, but was there any temptation to carry on and make music? Was that ever talked about?
Not really, I don't think. I think we all lead like two different lives to do it now. Like both Whiskers and I have kids, and Katie's pregnant and has a kid on the way, and Rob works at a school and has a pretty, important job there, and it's just, I guess, it just feels like if we were going to do stuff, I would want it to be really good, and I don't think we have enough time to make it really good.
Yeah. Okay, and I guess we move back to what you're doing now, really, Tom. I mean, I've seen some names that you've worked with, like the Cribs. Can you give us a bit of an insight to working with them?
I always feel a bit of a fraud for saying I've worked with the Cribs, because I have worked with the Cribs, but I basically did all the I mastered all the B-sides from. I don't think it was the last album. What was the last album they did?
Rockstar, 24/7 Rockstar.
Yes. So yeah, not that one. The one, the really poppy one they did.
Okay, right.
Yeah, so I mastered all the B-sides from that, and like the bonus tracks and stuff like that.
Cool.
So that's how I ended up working it. But we've known those guys for ages, because they some of our earliest gigs were with them, and in fact my old band played a gig with them as well. So, and it was nice to work with them, and honestly, they are some of the nicest people in music.
Yeah, it's what Dan was saying. I mean, they keep cropping up on the podcast, but they definitely seem like a band who are really keen to have that community thing with bands, and help each other out.
Don't get me wrong, some of the most fucked up, like in terms of being pissed people in music as well, I've ever seen in my life. But it was always great fun when you were with them, because it just, whenever you were playing gigs with the Cribs, it just felt like anything could happen. It felt on the edge. It felt like it could go badly wrong, but it could also be really funny and amazing.
I think, does Ross still live in Wakefield? I
think he does, yeah. And I never see him, but I'm always grateful, because he occasionally sends bands my way for work. Cool. So
so like, to a novice like me, Tom, can you just quickly describe what you're doing? So you're not producing, so you're like touching up the record once it's been produced?
Yeah, basically, yeah. So especially for albums, like the mastering's really important, in that you've got 10 mixes, and they might all sound great on their own, but they don't necessarily sound like one record, one cohesive whole. So mastering is the process of getting those 10 mixes and making them sound like a cohesive record, so that there are no big jumps in volume. There are no, there's not one really bright song and one really dark song, sonically, not like emotionally, and just making sure that it will sound good on different kinds of speakers and different listening environments. Like it might sound great in the room it was mixed in, but it might not sound great, on a big PA or on small speakers. And you try and as much as you can account for the difference in these things. And basically, I have a room here that's just as neutral a listening environment as you can possibly get.
Right.
And I tweak things to make it so that in most places it will sound better.
And you might have already touched on this, but have you carried on making music?
No, I mean, I try. Well, I sort of did a bit like very, very straight after the band, like just some electronic stuff. But no, I've tried. I've occasionally tried writing stuff, and I've just kind of come to the conclusion that I'm done with music for now. Well, who knows? But yeah, I can't see it. I still write words though. I like writing. Just
Okay.
I just like writing, but the music thing, I always found it really hard without anyone to bounce stuff off. And me and Whiskers were a really good kind of songwriting team, I think, in that we had quite different ideas of what not of aesthetics, where I think we were relatively close, but sometimes musically we had different ideas, in that I would quite often go for more obvious sort of emotional chord changes, and he would prefer something a bit more unexpected. And I think we worked well together in that we complemented each other's strengths and weaknesses. And I always found it really easy to either start an idea or finish an idea, and I could never do both. So
I put a question in about whether you got a funny story. I did put Liam on Noel Gallagher just because you found at the time they were kind of picking on new bands. So you found that some funny stories going around about them.
I don't have any. I never met them. I was a huge Oasis fan when I was a kid, so it's a shame. But yeah, The View. Yeah, this was The View we played with in Dundee. Was it Dundee?
Yeah, that's where they're from, I think, innit?
That is where they're from, right? Yeah, we played with The View in Dundee. And it'll be interesting. Maybe you can get their side of this if you ever have them on this program, because they seem like the kind of band who would be on here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, they seem like nice lads, but they were just like, they were all like 15, 16 years old or something, or it seemed that way. Maybe they weren't, but they seemed nice enough. But they were like, it was a 4-band bill, and I think they were on second. We were headlining, and there was a band on after them as well. But basically we had a dressing room, that had all a rider and all of our stuff in it, and the promoter basically came in and said, "Don't let The View in your dressing room. Don't let them in. Just don't let them in. Don't let those lads in. They'll fuck it up. They'll steal all your shit." We were like, no one had ever said anything like that to us about a band ever, so we were a bit like weirded out by it.
Yeah.
And then they come in and they seem nice enough and they're just chatting to us, but we're being a bit standoffish because the promoters literally just told us not to let them in. So they eventually, I guess, get the messages of us being weirded out by what the promoter said, and they're not there. And yeah, they play their set, so they're second on, and then the main support, who I can't remember who it was, play, and we go on. And basically so The View had all these like mates with them, like all these 15, 16-year-old kids, like probably about a group of 40, 50 of them. And the venue was maybe 300 capacity, something like that.
Okay.
Or 250. And they'd broken into the kitchen of this venue somehow. Right. So they had a load of like onions and frozen food and stuff, and they were just lobbing it at the stage. Like all these kids.
Well, while you were playing?
Yeah, while we were playing, yeah. And this like an entire like raw onion the size of a baby's head just whacked me in the temple, like in the second song or whatever. I thought it was fucking funny because these, they were they weren't booing, you know, they were sort of being jubilant while throwing shit. And you never quite lose that impulse, do you? Like that you have when bullies start bullying you, that you try and play along and act like it's funny. Like, so maybe that plays a part of it as well. But anyway, the whole gig was a bit weird like that. And then afterwards, we find out that that The View had done a quote unquote guerrilla gig in the toilet during our set as well. Right. And someone had ripped a urinal off the wall and they'd left the place in a right state.
Jesus, and that's in the hometown.
Yeah, well, and then we didn't think that much more of it, but then this band that was apparently the gig that ended up getting them signed. Like they had was it James Endicott?
Okay, right.
I think that was the guy's name. I think he was up there for that, and he they signed to whatever label it was just after that. And then they had a piece in the NME like a couple of months later or a few weeks later, and they just basically spent the entire thing slagging us off. Like it was like, and we sort of
just about that gig.
Just saying, oh, they were so up themselves. They were such dickheads. They were, you know, they were like, and we sort of half knew the journalist who had interviewed them, and he said, oh, I'm sorry about it, but it was basically all they talked about. So, and again, I don't know if that's true, and to be honest, I'm sure they're all totally nice lads, and we'd get on fine now. But it was the only time we ever came close to having a feud with anyone. It was very one-sided because they just seemed to fucking hate us, and we didn't really have that much of a problem with them.
Maybe they're a bit like you now, looking back and thinking, bloody hell, we're a bit.
Well, I'm sure they are, and I'm sure it was a really brief thing for them as well, where they just had that one interview where they slagged us off, and we ended up seeing it. But I'm sure it wasn't like they were sitting around every day fucking slagging Forward Rusher off.